Okay, so our first speaker is Hanta, Henning. And her topic is on mothering and othering, reading Fiela's child as an adoption narrative.
Good afternoon. I'm Hanta, Fanta with an H, easy to remember. I have to preface my talk by saying that I have unfortunately trained in corpus linguistics for many years and then started to reschool myself in the field of cultural studies. So I'm a newbie. If my talk seems overly quantitative or very methodological, please excuse me. It's the way I was made, but I'll try to make it accessible. All right. I should also start this talk with a disclaimer that I am myself an adoptive parent, and that is why my interest was piqued by studies into adoption narratives. This study is part of a larger body of work, which is my PhD, on adoption narratives and the search for kinship, belonging and community for adoptive parents. Briggs, Fonseca, Cardarello, Mark, Collard and Ingerson in 2012 says that there is, for the large part, a great feminist silence in terms of adoption and a general neglect of children and childhood in feminist theory. There's a difference, they say, between having an opinion on adoption and having an opinion on adoption as a feminist. Berlant, Stockton, Dubinsky, they all theorize the idyllic childhood, whereas the pervasive theory in feminism is that childhood is a period of repression and silencing, especially in schools, of pain, futility, and responding to violence and indifference, including the context of sexual abuse. The feminist silence of adoption, they posit, is because feminism struggles to theorize poverty and the precarity of reproduction. And the precarity of reproduction really comes into play in adoption studies. Furthermore, adoption operates on inequalities, where those with access to resources is starting to see adoption as a reproductive right. There have been feminist lobbies for welfare reform as well as the rights of birth mothers when it comes to adoption. The Concerned United Birth Mothers, or CUB, as well as the National Association of Black Social Workers in America have started to reclaim the rights of birth mothers. But my whole point in my study is that for adoptive parents, there really is no voice, there really is no community, there is no kinship, and no one is lobbying for us. The National Association of Black Social Workers calls the adoption process or the fostering process in America the browning of child welfare, because most children taken into most children taken into care in America are Black African American children, and they are mainly placed with white families. The case of South African adoption, therefore, we can say, really is concerned with the browning of adoption. Every year in South Africa, 53,000 babies are abandoned. More black and colored babies are abandoned than white babies, and unfortunately most adoptive parents are white. And therefore we can make a case for the browning of adoption in South Africa. When I read Phiela's Child in school, I really did not think of Phiela's Child as an adoption narrative at all. And Phiela's Child is generally not seen as an adoption narrative. But O defines adoption as the following, and I quote, severing the relationship between a child and his or her parents, transferring the custody to another parent or set of parents, and the adoption of an unrelated person. In this sense, we can posit that Phiela indeed adopted the white child, Benjamin. But Hayakawa tells us the following in his 1991 book. We create semantic maps, which are our verbal intentional world, which stands in relation to the extensional world as a map does to the territory it is supposed to represent. And Korzybski says in 1995, and I quote again, "The map is not the territory. The only usefulness of a map depends on the similarity of structure between the empirical world and the map." An adoption narrative can only paint for us the map of adoption. An adoption narrative is not the territory of adoption. The territory of adoption is what we, as members of the adoption triangle, adoptive parents, adoptee, and biological parents, live every day. And Nagy posits in her 2015 thesis that there are two main maps when it comes to adoption. The one is called the Adoption is Beautiful map, which is the general pervasive idea people have about adoption. Look what a wonderful thing you did, you saved this child, versus the Adoption Sucks map, which is usually what adoptees experience in their lives. However, we need to keep in mind, as I said, that adoption narratives are only the map. They are not the territory. Mothering is defined as a psychological transformation in women, moving from childlessness to bringing up a child for at least 12 years. I don't know why 12 years specifically, but that's what the sources say. Studies on African views of mothering are quite recent, with studies from Ashforth in 2000, Holland in 2001, etc. But few studies exist that place the theory of mothering in an African or a South African context, and I hope to address that with my studies of adoption narratives. Nakano Glenn posits that currently, and for many centuries before, women's position in society has been largely defined by female biological imperatives. And this, of course, places adoption narratives in the larger discussion surrounding feminism as well as mothering in feminism. Nakano Glenn says, and I quote, "Is mothering women's primary and sole mission and chief source of satisfaction, or one of many roles and sources of satisfaction? Is women's fate tied to their biological role in reproduction, or is biology only a minor factor? How much significance should we place on pregnancy and childbirth as putting women in a unique position that justifies special treatment?" Elliot Powell and Bronton further goes on to define good mothering as investing vast amounts of time, money, energy, and emotional labor in mothering. This, unfortunately, is mostly seen as the purview of affluent white mothers. Therefore, one could ask the question, is Phiela Kumuti a good mother, if this is the definition? Mothering can be further problematized in terms of adoption. Adoption in itself and as a practice queers motherhood, because the biological role of reproduction is removed from the parenting equation. Mothers are already othered, and as an adoptive parent, I can attest to this. Phiela is therefore not only othered in terms of her race, but also in terms of her mothering. Fisher states in a 2003 article that adoption is persistently perceived as not quite as good as having your own. And adoption narratives supply non-essentialist ways which challenge the dominant script of family and motherhood, of which Phiela is a very good example. Another important issue when we talk about adoption is that of nature versus nurture, where traditional views of mothering implies that pregnancy fosters an innate mothering instinct, which adoptive parents are theorized not to possess. And I would like to challenge anyone to show me how Phiela does not have a mothering instinct towards Benjamin. Nakano Glenn further says, any study of mothering needs to contend with pervasive ideologies which have shaped society's views of motherhood, including the identity of mothers. And Phiela is here a good example of nurture as opposed to nature. Bystrom says that in feminist discourse, the term motherhood has been replaced by mothering, and that we can identify certain phases of motherhood in feminist critique. First of all, in the time of Simone de Beauvoir, we got the repudiation of mothering, where mothering was seen as irreconcilable with feminism, and female biology was seen as innately oppressive. The second wave of seeing mothering is that of recuperation and reclamation, which started in the 1970s, with maternity being seen as complex and thoughtful and existing in dialogue with ideology. The current view is that mothering is labor. Maternity is active and relational, that mothers shape and mold children, and that is a labor of love. Fiela actually paints a picture of mothering which falls into the recuperation and reclamation of motherhood. In Fiela's child, the normative interracial adoptive modus, that of white parents adopting a black or mixed race child or children, is inverted. But for her trouble, Fiela is seen as a criminal. She is othered in terms of her race and mothering, because she's firstly raising a white child. Secondly, the Dutch Afrikaans white legal system prohibits her from raising this child. And thirdly, the British imperial expectations, systems and norms would also prohibit her from raising this child. Wilson states in 2013, at the core of this novel is the question of what creates the identity. Is it who one is born as, or who they become through circumstances? And that is the question that is answered, or at least addressed, in Fiela's child. Is Benjamin white because he is born white? Is he colored because he is raised colored? Or what is his identity? Fiela's othering can be saliently seen in the following quote from Fiela's child. You have a white child on your land and in your house among your own children, and you know as well as I do that that is not right. Fiela's mothering here is questioned, but not by Fiela herself. It is questioned because the child is so obviously not her own. The racial point of view says that she's not legally allowed to parent this child. And it calls into question not only Fiela's identity, but also the role of her mothering in Benjamin's upbringing. In terms of nature versus nurture, Fiela really shapes Benjamin through the nurture she gives him, rather than him being shaped through his nature, born white. And we can see this saliently in two quotes from the novel. He called me Mrs. Ebenezer, it's too terrible, like a colored. And secondly, the little brat would realize that it would not pay him to play tricks, that he would be made white again and learn to be obedient. He was no longer in the long kloof. Because Benjamin acts colored, as nurture weighs more heavily than nature in his upbringing, he is also othered, even by his white family. Benjamin's identity, therefore, I argue, rests more on Fiela's nurturing than on his nature. He knew he was white, and his mother and father, and David and Tolly and Kitty and Emma, brown. He was white because he was the hand child. This really reaffirms Fiela's identity as his mother. And as Fiela acknowledges Benjamin's identity, Benjamin reaffirms Fiela's identity as a mother. Fiela confronts those who aim to take away her child by saying, say what you mean. Say because Benjamin is a white foundling. If he had been like us, no one would have said a word about it. Here we are confronted with a white family, who we don't know who they are, who lost their son and never looked for him, which is a case of child negligence. Yet, even they would be preferable to Fiela, who has mothered Benjamin for years and has a mothering question based solely on her race. There's a clear link between Fiela's mothering and interracial adoption. I don't know how many of you are aware of the new Children's Act that is going to be hopefully not implemented, but the fact that abandoned children or orphans are going to be placed with the children are going to be placed with racially matched families, so that brown children are placed with brown families, white children are placed with white families. And I think we see echoes of this in Fiela's child, that a white child should be placed with a white family. What are the conclusions we can draw from Phiela's child as an adoption narrative? Firstly, as an adoption narrative, Phiela opposes the Cinderella aspect of adoption, where the child is saved from desperate circumstances to live a better life. Yes, Phiela does save the child from certain death in the Karoo, but does she do it because she feels it's a humanitarian act? Does she do it because she is a mother? Does she do it because it's a labor of love? The Cinderella aspect is very problematic in terms of adoption narratives, as adoption is mainly painted in a negative light. Phiela further opposes the superiority of the global north. In adoption narratives, the global north is seen as the be-all and end-all, and that children from the global south should be saved and raised in the global north so that they can be more white. Further, Phiela supports liminality. Benjamin and Phiela affirm each other's identities, which is very important because a lot of adoption narratives is about the struggle of finding an identity, especially as an adoptee. Portley and Cuthbert quote that a pervasive opinion amongst adoptees is that I didn't know who I was, but I knew who I was not. Phiela also opposes international adoption practices of the time. At that time, migrant workers in America who gave birth, their children was adopted by white families and then sold on to be child laborers on other farms. If this was the status quo of the time, we can clearly see that Phiela opposes these international adoption practices where children were seen as raw materials. Finally, Phiela can be seen to reclaim mothering in the fact that she fights for her child, she does not give up on him, and she stands by her right to mother him as a colored mother with a white child. Thank you.
So our next speaker is Wacango Kimani, and the title is The Discourse on Young Pregnancy in Research and Education, Options for Constructive Engagement and Exclusion.
Good afternoon, my name is Wacango Kimani. I'm a PhD candidate at the Bid School of Education. What I'm presenting is not part of my research. This is previous work I had done some time ago. But earlier this year, my interest was piqued when I came across some work that was happening that was said to be innovative work with young mothers. And what struck me was that this work that was being done in some informal settlements in Nairobi was said to be innovative and it was groundbreaking. But what shocked me was that the particular project referred to young pregnancy, to various research on young pregnancy as a menace. And I found that very contradictory when they thought they were being innovative, while at the same time they were still painting young pregnancy as a menace. So the purpose of my presentation today is to look at, to problematize the commonly used discourse on young pregnancy and to identify ways that young schooling mothers and young women who are pregnant while at school, how do we ensure that they have access, they engage and participate in school, and they succeed in their schooling. And also to acknowledge that young women's agency is an important aspect when we are looking at young schooling mothers and young pregnancy, and looking for ways to disrupt the disempowering discourses and the patronizing and punitive discourses that other young sexuality, young pregnancy, and young mothers. So I'll begin by highlighting what we call in inclusive education the dilemma of difference, and it also appears in other disciplines. And the idea is that difference is often associated with deviance and stigma. And this is based on socially constructed perceptions and unquestioned assumptions of the dominant culture. So when we see someone who is different, we are not questioning what assumptions are being created to say that this person is different. And one of the when I teach this area in inclusive education, I usually ask the students to find out when their grandmothers or great-grandmothers had their first babies, and whether that was considered difference. And if it wasn't, why is it difference today, and why is it problematic today? The idea of difference, especially in terms of schooling, we look for ways in which children who are identified or learners who are identified as different, how will they go about their schooling without being stigmatized on the basis of their difference? And the idea is, the question is, do we focus or not focus on the difference? And that is the dilemma, is that if we do not focus on the difference, we may not look at the problems that a child, or the needs that a child who's considered different may face. But on the other hand, by attending to the learner's difference, we then are able to attend to their problems. But at the same time, we are highlighting their deviation from what is perceived as normal. But however, dilemma must be recognized in order to find creative ways to resolve it. And one of the ways of doing this is that has been highlighted in inclusive research is voice research, in which we sample a group who identify to be different, but in sampling the group to find out what are their lived experiences in school, we are also labeling that group, and we may reinforce the stigma and perpetuate their deviance. But however, listening without disaggregating their difference and distinguishing them from the wider population of learners because of their identity markers, we will miss some important aspects to ensure their schooling. So what we need to do is question the assumptions we are making about the world that the children or the learners are living in, or the world that we are creating for the learners. And we need to also challenge the normal and abnormal dichotomy that difference is usually presented within. And in so doing, when we are questioning the assumptions, we're also looking for ways to invent ways to deal with the difference, to treat children who are considered different in a variety of ways. But most importantly, we are looking at difference and difference as just human experience. We are not the same. None of us are the same, even though we sometimes consider ourselves quote-unquote normal. So when it comes to young pregnancy and young schooling mothers, the concern is often presented in all sorts of ways. But from an education perspective, we are looking for ways that will ensure that they access education, that they feel they belong to the school, that they participate fully in school, and they achieve as well as they would want to with their schooling. But there is, of course, issues around young pregnancy that are undeniable. And we all know the undeniable consequences of young pregnancy, high child and maternal mortality. Many of them is through forced marriage and rape. Young women suffer horrendous violence. They have delivery complications, there are unsafe abortions, high school dropout rates among young women who become pregnant when they're in school. Many children born to young mothers have low birth weight and they suffer malnutrition. And the mothers also suffer from mental and emotional health impacts because of their stigma. But when we're looking at it from a schooling perspective, we're not problematizing. We're not saying that young women who become pregnant or young women who become mothers after their pregnancy while they're still at school, that it is an issue for their schooling. And therefore, when I'm looking at it, when we look at young pregnancy and young mothering in terms of schooling, and we are looking for ways in which we want to see motherhood without the stigma of young pregnancy. And with that, especially when we talk about research is really with young mothers as co-researchers. It's often on young mothers, and this is disempowering, disables their self-efficacy and their agency. So I'll highlight some of the terms that are often used that refer to young women when they are pregnant, while they're in school, or young schooling mothers. Most of them come from a moralistic perspective that blame young motherhood or young mothering and young pregnancy as arresting development. They are blamed for the lack of development in a community. Young women are depicted as irresponsible and a sign of moral degeneration. Particularly the term teenage. Teenage is associated with othering and the stigma of young pregnancy. It increases the victimization of school-age mothers. It highlights what is deficient about them, and it promotes exclusion and marginalization in school. And McLeod points out that the reason for this construction is because we gender morality and give women the burden of the moral discourse within a community. And this, one of the reasons this has happened, especially with the using of the word teenage, is where adolescence has been created, more recently created, this is probably less than 100 years old, was created as a transitional stage in development. And therefore, before we were either children and then adults. But when adolescence was created as this transitional period, we then began to problematize any issues that we have that are within this age, the age group that is considered as teenage. And at the core of these popular representations of teenage pregnancy, and I say teenage because I do not use that term, it's what is often used in the literature. It's a range of normative assumptions about what young people should or should not do with respect to their sexuality and reproduction. And it's also the cultural and ideological positions about pregnancy, parenting, and families. The other term often used is the word menace, the menace of young pregnancy and the menace of young women who become pregnant, or the menace of young schooling and sometimes girls, is to punish young women's sexual desire. These punitive discourses and the negative perceptions of young women's sexuality is obviously ideological. The other term that is used is that it is a pervasive phenomenon and it is growing at an alarming rate. And the question is, one must problematize is, what is the ratio of girls who start schooling at grade 1 and to the ratio of young women who become pregnant? And that's one ratio that people never want to use. What they want to look at is when the young women who are pregnant, it is the ratio of the young women in the class at the time to the rest of the girls in the school, rather than how many started school and how many now are dropping out because of pregnancy, and not looking at it in the wider context of all the other issues that create school dropouts. So now the impact of these perspectives on young women who become pregnant and young women who become mothers in schooling is a marginalization and their exclusion from school. So the construction of young women as a problem, young mothers as a problem, and young women who are pregnant as a problem, as a menace, means that they're marginalized from school and they are identified almost as tenants on the margins of school. So even if they are in school, their inclusion in school is very tenuous. They suffer although marginalization is a complex issue, they suffer a lot of bullying, a lot of gossip, and that leads to a lot of mental anguish. Teachers have a great part to play in creating this environment of marginalization and exclusion. Many teachers say, I am not trained to teach young mothers. And I'll talk about that a bit later. And this shows the attitudes that I mentioned in the words that are used about young mothers that are presented in school. So school just mirrors what's happening out of school and the attitudes towards young pregnancy. So to ensure access, participation, and success of young mothers in school requires a change in our perception of what young pregnancy and young schooling mothers are about. And from an inclusive perspective, we look at it, we value the subjective views of young mothers. We look at it that we need an insider's perspective of their lived experiences, and therefore we then are able to consider options for what will ensure that they access, they participate, and they belong in school without feeling that they are tenants at the margins of our education system. And an inclusive perspective doesn't judge or label the young women as having a problem because they are mothers, or a problem because they have they are pregnant. We look at it, diversity, as just an essential aspect of human development. And therefore, with that, we are able to have an insider's perspective, listen to their voices, and often hidden voices of these young women, to identify what are their lived experiences and how can we ensure that they succeed in school. So I'll highlight some findings from research that I conducted, that in which I acknowledge the young women's agency and identify them as their engagement in identifying their lived experiences, not as research on them, but research with them, and therefore they were my co-researchers. So we were conducting this research together to identify what ways can we ensure that they are included, fully included within the school. And in so doing, the young women came up with a term that they prefer to refer to themselves, and they said they prefer to be called young schooling mothers, and not all the other terms that they found marginalized them and identified them as othered them within the school community. In working with them as co-researchers, the young women were able to become more goal-oriented about the future of their education and the future of their children. And coming together, because they were both from two schools in the south of Joburg, and there were a group of them, they developed a camaraderie that helped them develop optimistic outlook about how they will conduct their education and how they would want to look into the future. In so doing, they developed coping strategies. They also were able to identify their own marginalization and the marginalization of other learners in their school who they could see were also having the same dilemma as they were. So among the things that we identified at the end was how would we recognize their difference? And when we recognize difference in two ways. There's a helpful way when we recognize difference. So there's a helpful recognition of difference. And a helpful recognition of difference is that young women many of them would have issues of childcare. Therefore, after school activities need to consider that they may not be able to stay on in school until the end of the school day, 6 or 7 or whatever time that the school decides that there will be after school activities. So it would be helpful to identify that in that case, that difference needs to be recognized. But they also identified what was unhelpful. They had teachers who would constantly distinguish them in class as young mothers, and it didn't matter whether you're a mother or not when it came to class discussions. It didn't matter whether you're a mother or a father in the case of some of their classmates. And so finally, in looking at what enables the inclusion of young women and young schooling mothers in school, young pregnant women and young schooling mothers in school, the policy is very clear that they should be that they are not to be excluded from school. However, the policy still is vague. So there are terms like school age. Learners who are pregnant, who are school age, already identifies them as teenagers. And of course that creates, of course, the issue of exclusion. The issues of accommodation, like I mentioned before, about the recognition of difference. it is vague in saying that young schooling mothers need to be accommodated within reasonable steps. Who determines what are reasonable steps? And finally, I just meant to mention that more recent research by McLeod posits that we need to have a reparative justice approach to young women who become pregnant while they are in school. And they identify that we need to identify the multiple injustices that young women experience, the power relations that young women's reproductive actions are delimited, and that there is need to be provision of social and material support for women, and looking at the influences, the societal influences on gender roles and ideals. Thank you.
Okay, so our next speaker is Nomancotsho, Pakade, revisiting motherhood as solidarity.
Afternoon, everyone. Yes, there's a blessing about doing slides just at this moment. Some people call me Noma, it's understandable. My name is Nomancotsho. It's a bit difficult to pronounce at times, but you're forgiven if you say Noma, so long as you also acknowledge there's a fuller version to it. I'm a student at UP. I'm also a researcher here at VETS in Hanta. Today I'll be sharing a sub-category theme that I'm still developing for my thesis. The question for my thesis is what constitutes freedom for Black women in post-1994 South Africa? And I use life histories, and there's two groups that I focus on. The first group, I call them thought leaders or social commentators, so women who are activists, feminists, or who are leaders in their respective fields and that sort of thing. The second group, I call them limited English, ordinary women. And they're mothers of activists in the 1980s, specifically Val. And so I'll be sharing 4 narratives from the second group. And I thought I should share just a bit of that background. And so I use life history narrative with a specific focus on the theme of motherhood. And also as a way to surface the conversations on how they experienced as a way of witnessing their own children fighting for their own dreams in their own activist context in the 1980s. I specifically chose Val, which is in the southeast of Johannesburg, as another way of appreciating township-based resistance and outside the meta-narrative of Soweto. Some of you might be aware of the Sahwira massacre, some of you might be aware of the second biggest trial is the Delmas trial. Some of you might be aware of the many boycotts that happened. So really Val, in terms of the political life in our history, is quite a rich, it's not just one township, I think it's about 5, and it's based on three surrounding cities in the area. And so I begin with the assumption that motherhood is a constant expectation of women, and it remains as a powerful demand in present-day South Africa, and is still generally considered unusual for women to opt out of motherhood, not as a body limitation by default. And so the social norms that are dominant as a way of conceptualizing understanding ways of being frame womanhood primarily within the family, the expectant, nurturing, and homemaker with a biological predisposition to birth. And so women are expected to be mothers either by their partners, their faith leaders, their communities, and so forth. And this assumption, underpinned by biological determinism, is informed by the strict vision of two sexes, a gender binary, which favors heterosexual as a sexual orientation. However, this is not to lock women as subjects within conservative articulations of motherhood that are automatically tied to patriarchy, but to acknowledge that they are raised as daughters in ways that influence their choices of family formations and sexuality. And so motherhood is embedded in cultural and historical accounts as an institution with a social status. It assigns values to the practices of childbirth and childbearing deemed acceptable by a particular society in a moment in time. And so motherhood is explored in both participant groups, but like I said, I'm only going to focus on the second one. And this is not to necessarily reduce the mother's experiences of raising activists, reducing rather their womanhood into the category of motherhood, but as a way to illustrate the complications when thinking about Black subjectivity in South Africa, that the role of family is not treated as an independent element, as it is both a category the state monitors and rewards, and as a meaning-making space of belonging. And so with this paper, I tried to complicate the notion of solidarity. And so I'm not defining solidarity, and of course, as part of the broader project, I'm looking at the two charters in South Africa, 1954 and 1994, as a way of trying to think through these issues. And so we know in terms of the meta-narrative, non-racialism becomes one of their key poles, but we also know that in terms of the Federation of South African Women that actually came about in the first Women's Charter, that there was a lot of tensions and conversations in terms of how that solidarity manifested as such. We had later on the Black Women's Federation, but that was short-lived. So I just wanted to qualify that there's broader readings of reading solidarity in terms of this work. But in this case, I'm more interested in solidarity in motherhood. And motherhood here, I mean, whether the solidarity depends upon the celebration of multiple pathways to mothering. But the focus is on solidarity in action. And so I use motherhood as a gendered category of analysis, while using the gendered experience of motherhood as a needed experience of practice. And so I'll share briefly the four stories, or rather the life history narratives, to illustrate the point of motherhood as a lived experience and what I made of the analysis. So the first one is Mrs. Mkwesha, who's a widow of two kids. The story here is that most of these women moved from the Free State small farms. They went through farm schooling, and they moved to the Vaal in the 1960s, the beginning of the 1960s, and they were in their 20s. And part of moving to Vaal was to find better opportunities from housing, work, and also in terms of schooling for their kids. And most of them, they recall the 1960s as young people, either in their early marriages or trying to find work and so forth. And so Mrs. Mkwesha worked in retail and did different kinds of jobs. And as a widow in the community, she was raised as a respectable woman, has never been seen with a man because her man died. And she's a mother of 3 kids. But what's interesting about the narrative is that she actually ended up being a halfway house for a lot of the MK veterans from Soweto who were transiting to Lesotho via the Vaal and the Free State. And one of the stories that she tells is that of Peter Mkwesha. Some of you might know Peter Mkwesha, who was one of the NC's presidents in Post-Colonial for South Africa. So Peter Mkwesha was missioned to burn the Sasu Bridge, and there were 2 other comrades that were sent to accompany him on this mission. One of them is named as Ospeech Moyise. And so Mrs. Mkwesha receives word via her work that she should be hosting these young people, and she treats them as young MK veterans. And one of the things that she was tipped off was that someone had already betrayed them in their communication. That the police knew that she would be hosting these young people, and so she had to find alternative housing for them. And indeed, her house was raided at 3 a.m. And the search went on until about 10:05 in the morning. But luckily, they did not find anything. And she retells the story and says she was actually quite anxious that the young people would be caught and that they would break and actually turn on her. And the protocol, or rather the expectation, would be as an older comrade, she would have to take the fall for the young ones. The second story is that of Mrs. Zodetsi, also from Free State, moving to Vaal. She's a teacher in a school. She gets adopted, or rather approached by a couple, the Swanes. Mr. and Mrs. Swane, a part of a network of teachers in the Vaal who are supporting young activists in the different schools. And this is largely post-1976, where there were a lot of boycotts in terms of staying away from school around the Afrikaans, the medium of instruction and so forth. And so they were amongst the few teachers who were supporting the students, and they co-opted Mrs. Zodetsi also to be part of this teachers' network. And one of the interesting stories that Mrs. Zodetsi tells is this mother figure that Mrs. Swane was in terms of relaying information. So unlike Mrs. Mkwesha, who housed them, whether they brought in explosives in the house or whether they brought in material editors. Here, Mrs. Swane plays a very minimal role in terms of sharing information from the husbands into the learners and supporting the learners when their raids are anticipated or when community halls are meant to be raided. And so these first 2 narratives that I'll just briefly summarize, they really speak to a sense of direct involvement, that these women themselves are politically conscientized, and as part of their life histories, they also share earlier stories in terms of how they came to be politically conscientized and as to why they became involved in their support for the young activists. But the last 2 narratives are quite different. So the third story is that of Mrs. Mkwesha, average township woman, gave birth to 8 kids. Her line was, there were no contraceptives at that time, I kept popping them. And she goes on about how the boys would be in the garage and they would talk about different things, and she started noticing that they were singing Swahili songs, and she would eavesdrop, and there was always an older man in the garage who was sort of lecturing and giving them all sorts of conversations that were politicized. And that's the little that she gets, that her kids are now, politically active in all the things that were happening in the township at that time. And after most of these meetings, a lot of these young people were jailed, and there were several raids into the family. Moses Mkwesha also talks about the contradictions of witnessing the child as an activist, where they would hear, well, she narrates this one incident where she was washing her dishes, and she heard a song echoing from afar, and it was Moses Mkwesha, and people were quite anxious in terms of what was happening. And eventually she realized that they were doing a door-to-door campaign, forcefully putting out all the young men in the households and their fathers to come and join the meetings. And if people refused, they were told that this is over now, we'll fetch you later. And so she recalls many of these incidences in terms of witnessing what was happening more to her child. An interesting story that she tells is Uziezi, who ended up in exile, was jailed around Val, also downtown Johannesburg, and also in Pretoria. And she was one of the main members who went back and forth and sending parcels. On one occasion, Uziezi had an unusual request. He requested clothes. And she didn't think much of it as to why would a jailbird need clothes. But in any case, she sent the clothes and the many parcels. Uziezi returned the jeans on the basis that they do not fit. He had lost a lot of weight. So she tried to adjust the jeans and realized that actually there were notes that were sewn in the different parts of the jeans. And the different young people came to collect the different parts of the genes that information they were using. And so she tells this one story to say that she was complicit and supportive, but at the same time as an unknowing participant. And she never necessarily called out her son or refused to be this person in between, even though she never fully understood what was contained in many of these parcels. The last narrative, also of another unknowing ally, is Umankoli. Some of you might know Samuel. Some of you that know me know I've been very obsessed with Samuel for the past 10 years of my life. But one of the interesting things about Samuel is that he's internationally renowned as an anti-apartheid gay activist and so forth. But his mother, who's alive, shares different memories as to how he remembers his son before he became this famous anti-apartheid activist. And so Mankoli, similar to Mrs. Mkwesha, they were not necessarily involved in political organizing, nor were they supportive of any of the things that were happening in the township. But because of their children, they became politically conscientized, or rather were forced to participate in those instances. So Mankoli went to a couple of church meetings, would also receive word through church, and the text read and also home in terms of where Simon was arrested. So Simon was part of the student activists in Val from 1976. He got arrested just about every year between May and June as part of a preventative measure between 1978 and 1983. And then in 1984 he gets arrested as part of the Demos, accused number 13 of the 22 Demos trials from 1984 to 1988. And so one of the interesting things before the Demos trial is that Umankoli becomes part of the informal mothers groups who keep checking on their kids, who pray, and also don't quite understand in terms of why do they keep doing this? Why do they keep, doing and boycotting when they know what religion is about? But eventually there are other structures that are formally established, such as the Detainees Parents Committee Group, and also the ANC that would send different parcels via the UDF to all these other spaces. What I find interesting about Mankoli's case is that in as much as she feels like the informal networks of women was a source of strength and inspiration and so forth, in post-1994 South Africa, she actually feels that many of these women were recognized as mothers of heroes, or they were given some form of recognition, and other families were even compensated. And she feels that also her child fought for the struggle, but she's never received any cent or anything like it. And so in the first two accounts, the women were directly involved in the politics, while the second group, the mothers, were pulled into activism by their children. They became conscientized through their children, yet they continued to protect their children in solidarity. I would argue that it was the politicized context of violence that enabled this political information. They recalled their first encounters with whiteness in Free State and also other encounters within Gauteng violent context that enabled them, rather than facilitated them to support their kids in terms of their own political inclination. They also recalled the Shabo massacre as something quite fresh as newbies in the township setting that happened when they just arrived in the town. And at the same time, they also recall that when they tried to stop their children from participating in any of these activities, they were often met with criticism that the older generation was quite complicit, they were carrying in, and they did not want to be as militant as the young people were. And so many of them felt, it was time, they needed to. And also the rent went up, never mind the dog pass, the buses, the water. So there are many issues that are happening within the context of violence that I think made it easier for the mothers to support their kids. And so what I'm trying to do with this piece is to say, or rather position motherhood not in the traditional sense of caregiving through the tropes of cooking and so forth, but rather to illustrate how these women co-opted motherhood using their caregiving role to house and relay information amongst the young activists. Again, there's nothing new in this research, I think. If we have to look back historically in South Africa in the early 1900s, you have women like Mkwesha who housed a lot of young women, facilitated them into the city to be workers, domestic workers. And so this category that I call comrade mother, this category of comrade mother is not new in that sense. So in the early 1900s, you have right to the 40s and 60s, you have Umasisulu to understand the notion of social work and how different medicines were rotated around, including Abu Mama Action, Abu Batabile, and many others that benefited from that informal dispensation of actually medicines in the township setting. And again, Winnie Mandela, I'm sure many people know in terms of how she becomes this mother. So the notion of comrade mother is not new. But what I think is interesting, I also don't think it's necessarily new, is what these mothers at least taught me in terms of mother ally. And this is the relationship that I find interesting because these are mothers who are not necessarily comfortable. For example, someone's mother battled with someone being gay throughout his life. But at the same time, she was very sympathetic to gay people that were discriminated within the township setting. And at the same time, she would go and speak of her son, even as a student or in jail in other spaces, even though she did not necessarily believe in the approaches that they took. And so I leave it at that to say so far I found these two categories that are not so new, but I think they're interesting ways in conceptualizing motherhood. And that's why I titled my piece, Revisiting Motherhood, in a sense that it's not new, but it's a way of thinking through solidarity. I'm sure in other parts of the world when we think about the literature, we would go as far as using brotherhoods and sisterhood and so forth, but I thought let me ground it more in the life history narratives and let the stories illustrate the solidarity and action that I'm trying to make sense of. Thank you so much.
Okay, this thing is refusing.
There we go.
But now, how do we go to the next one?
Just go to the next one.
Is that the first one?
Yes. I was talking about this organization that I founded in Finland and the activism that we are doing from using this space. So I want to talk specifically about one campaign that we did. The main thinking is that we should decolonize the way humanitarian appeals are done. Well, I will not talk about the theories. I think the main theory here that I'm using in analyzing some of these images that are used in the humanitarian appeals is the post-colonial theory, looking at, for example, Stuart Hall's explanation of how images, works of art, language, and discourse function as systems of representation and produce certain ways of knowing self and others and how one relate with them. I also use Edward Said's Orientalism and Mohanty's Under Western Eyes, which reveals the research that happens from a Eurocentric white gaze and what it produces. I also use Maria Lebon towards decolonizing feminism in analyzing some of these images. The Ancestor is an epistemic colonial exhibition of a Black African girl child in Finland was the encounter at this with this girl, with this image of a girl. So I read this encounter with this girl that was being used in humanitarian appeals from tracing it from colonial history, starting with the history of exhibiting and eroticizing black female bodies at street carnivals, museums, churches during the 19th century. For example, Sarah Batman, branded as Hottentot Venus, was brought from her home in South Africa, exhibited at freak shows and museums in France and Britain. Also, Rosa Emilia Clay, she was brought by Finland, by Finnish missionaries from Namibia. She was displayed at churches, gatherings, and she was a good singer, and she was made to sing to raise money for missionary work. But what was interesting in Rosa Clay's situation is that in Finland she became very competent and she learned the language, Finnish language. She became a Finnish language teacher. She was very active in the cultural scene. She was a very good musician, talented person, but she was never accepted, even though she was even teaching Finnish as a language. She was a Finnish language teacher, but she was never accepted. So I'm tracing this. I said that the situation of this young Zambian girl, her name was called Frida, follows in the path of her African ancestors, as she has been exhibited in the streets and bus stops of Finland in 2017 to 2018. This 12-year-old Zambian girl became pregnant in Zambia. She was impregnated by another young boy who was 15 years old. They were in school. So Plan International Finland, working with Plan Zambia, working with Plan Global, decided to do a fundraising campaign in order to raise awareness about the epidemic of child motherhood pregnancies of girls in Africa. So in this campaign, they used her. We could find her on bus stops, on terminuses. There was also social media, intensive social media, and then there was newspaper also. There was a lot of campaigns using her. And the campaign that they used, when they first saw it, we tried to go to Plan International Finland to talk to them. But when we went to the office, to the center, they refused to talk to us. They refused even to give us space to talk to us. And then we tried to explain that we want to understand why you are using this girl with her face, with her name, with her place, wherever she comes from. So we just want to talk with this, if there's another way that you can fundraise, but not doing this to this girl. But they were not willing to engage with us. I went, me and another colleague, the lady woman that I went with. So we found ourselves in a very difficult situation. We were not activists. We were like, myself, I considered myself a teacher, a lecturer, a researcher, not an activist. Although I engaged in teaching for freedom, I've been active in that sense. So now we had either to just leave it and go and forget about it. But we thought, no, this was not okay. So I went to start a small campaign on Twitter to tweet to them, just to tweet about that campaign, that it was not okay. You cannot use, because they refused to talk to us. But it did not pick quick enough. Maybe after we left, within a week, they removed the campaign ended. It was not because of us that it was about to end. We went there late because it was another place. So when the campaign ended, you said, okay, it was over, so then we can continue everybody with their lives. So then after some months, that campaign got prizes. So it got prizes in Hassan & Partners. It's a very big agency in Europe, but it's based in Finland, but it's in many European countries and US as well. That was awarded a prize for this called the Vudin Group. It is a very big prize. And then they were awarded also another accolade in Art Directors Club of Europe for creativity that considered the campaign to have profound social and cultural impact. And then it was awarded many prizes actually. Some of them I have not listed them here. So then we saw that now this was becoming they are celebrating this, and when we are saying it's a problematic campaign, it could just end without continuing with it. So after this crisis, we really felt bad when we were in one of the big theaters. There were so many, and then there was this picture of this girl in the middle of this big theater with so many people where this other prize was being given, this Mudun Viput. Then we thought, this was not okay, because and also the social media following what the discussion there was that black people, men are rapists, and this child was made pregnant, and then there was also a talk about black women being hypersexual, and even girls are engaged in sex. So we saw that if we have to find a way to respond to this. So then we decided to think of responding. So I wrote a paper responding to this. I said it was titled "Why Were We Not Outraged? Is a Black Child Not a Child?" And that I quoted that this campaign, it failed in ways that a white person living under the protection of global white supremacy and white privilege will never know nor fully understand. See, race continues to function in painful ways for us, black and brown people. This pain that was caused by this campaign in our African and African diaspora and people of color in communities is the pain of systemic and institutional racism. This is a quotation from that article that I wrote. So after I wrote that article, we actually decided to have a campaign, because now we saw that there was more celebration of the white women who had worked on this campaign with some men, and one of them is the Mary Courtney. She's a celebrated photographer there, and she has been doing this kind of work of taking pictures from Africa and coming and do exhibitions there. She had done another controversial exhibition of Maasai girls. She went there, took the photos when they were going through their female circumcision. She took the private parts and even blood where it was falling, and it was a gross exhibition. That even UNICEF actually wrote a statement that this was not okay and tried to challenge it. And then the Finnish court, they said that she followed protocol. Those Maasai people signed agreement that she would take. Then we tried to raise that, but this Maasai, what language was used to talk to this Maasai, and was it? Did they know that the private is going to be displayed like this during the whole process? So we saw that now if we keep quiet again, now if we keep quiet this second one, then this Zambian girl, this is going to become a culture. So we responded to that. So she was also working with a fashion designer who's also a celebrity. Her name is called Paula Saonen, who designed the clothes, and she was mentioning that the style was cheerful, romantic feel, and all that. She's using a lot of sexualizing language, and that we found problematic. So in response, we finally decided to launch a campaign against this. We decided to go and demonstrate at this Plan International Finland. That was my first organizing a demonstration. Then we started a Facebook so that we go to demonstrate, so that maybe they can be aware that no, this is not okay. So one Finnish white woman designed this poster for us. This was the poster that we used. So with many other posters, but that was the main poster in social media and Twitter and Facebook, and we really did a mounting campaign now. But when we mounted that campaign and then went to demonstrate, and then we gave Plan International in Finland a petition to detain the prices now. We're saying detain all those prices because this is not okay. So we talked here, we talked to the director of Plan International Finland, and there were 20-something of us who managed to go. We didn't want many people actually. Many people wanted to come, but it was our first time. We were suffering from fear, and so we wanted it to be small so that we can just end in and leave. petition, I wanted you to see this, but now with this computer that is giving small problem, I'm not sure whether we can copy this and play it. Can you help?
Yeah.
This video so that you could see. So we did this kind of, after we gave him this petition, they responded after then that we had raised the 3 issues: white savior complex, stigmatization, eroticization, and some other conditions. Then we also raised the condition of retaining the prices. I want this to see. Okay, so we addressed the list of conditions, and so they responded to our petition. They apologized for white savior complex, and then they refused. So they responded to our petition that we entered in. They apologized for the white savior complex, and then they refused to apologize for all these other things. And then they said they were not retaining the prices, and then they said they were also not going to acknowledge the other Africans that they worked with from Zambia. So when they refused like that, then we started an online petition, change.org. So people signing now. So that one, it was more, it made them more uncomfortable because now it was online, it was international. And then it was picked by in Zambia by some activists, by some celebrities in Zambia, and then it was picked by the news media in Zambia. Then it was seen that they'd gone to Zambia without permits to even take. They were not allowed to even have done that because they'd gone without permits and so forth. So it became a big thing between the Zambian government and the Finnish government. And then the Swedish newspapers, Sweden picked it up. Some other places picked it up online. So I think from that we also learned that an online campaign is better than running around with all these things, because we had, I think, strayed for about 6 months, not achieved much. But the moment we started this online campaign, it peaked, and then there was a response. So I would like you to see the video that was done by TRT, a very big international media in Turkey. They did a video when they followed the news, and then they did this video capturing all the events that we did. Okay, so I wanted to show you because the campaign, 2 seconds,
What shocked me was the way she was eroticized, and then the price that was on the side of the campaign, and then there was this name of the designer. I was shocked to think that a child is being used like this.
For the collection, I called it Hampton's look. It's like stripes and a little marine kind of a feel, light blue, and it's cheerful, happy, kind of like a little bit romantic.
Do you think that it would be possible even to use a Finnish chapter in this way?
confident that we were not harming this child and that we were still safeguarding her.
So I think after it became big, the media getting, eventually they agreed to give a public apology. Then the Art Directors Club, it's a very big European organization that gives the prizes. They also removed all the prizes.
All you moms out there know that your first pregnancy is nerve-wracking, and those ultrasounds can have their own cousin needles. So it was for James and Emily Stark, who found out 18 years ago they were pregnant for the first time, and the news that came.
Okay, so they apologized, and the prizes were all everywhere they displayed. They removed it, and the other prizes that they were supposed to get, they finally did not get it. But what was good that came out of this is that there was a lot of discussion with even the government on how to rethink how they keep on using the children, because this was not the first time. We had talked to them about 3 other campaigns that they had used the children again. So they didn't have much understanding about Africa, and they said they didn't have much understanding about racism. They didn't have, so they had good intentions, but they had no knowledge. So we let on encourage them to have workshops, and then Plan Global, the headquarters came and we had an agreement on the workshops that they were supposed to do, and they did these workshops, and now they are doing with all the humanitarian organizations in Finland, which is a good thing. And Plan Global said they were now going to do these workshops with all the Plan franchises, so that they can have a better understanding of using the children. I think this is it. Just want you to be aware of this, but what we really learned from this is that yes, we can do demonstrations, they work, they put pressure, but for us they did not work. And talking, going to negotiate, it can work, but for us it did not work. But when we started doing the international online campaign, it really worked for us. So because it creates an international community that is not involved, because we had activists from Zambia who became very active, we had activists from Kenya who became in South Africa. There were some few who picked it up as well. And then social media really picked it up, and it helped the campaign to pick up. Within 3 days, we had all these apologies. We had Plan Global, all of them talking to us. But talking with demonstrating it failed to work. So I think the online social media for activists, I think it's a platform that can help us to do campaigns that we might want to do, but we need to create networks so that when you start the campaign, if you want it to be transnational, then we need to be in coordination with other activists in other countries, so that you start sharing it all at the same time, and I think it can become more effective. With all this censoring and so forth, I think transnational social media campaign can be a liberating space for us to fight for some of the things that we want.
Thank you so much for your presentations. We are behind the time. And then it's theater, conversation with Natalie. So I'll open the floor after questions. Helena, yes, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Thanks.
Thank you, ladies, so much for your beautiful presentations. I just on the adoption, share my story, and I don't know maybe I was approached wrong. Where I was in a restaurant and there was a family with their adopted brown children, and one of them was a child who looked like me. And it was like small baby, obviously curious, and that I think in his face he had that recognition. And now it's a baby. We have to smile because it's a baby, right?
Yes.
So I smiled and waved, and the mother just gave me this look, like how dare you look and wave at my child? And it's a thing, I mean, if those who watch This Is Us, I watch it, on identity, raising a black child, a black male child, and where race is a big issue. And how do you deal with that? And I also had, we know this lady who's a lecturer, and she said, oh, Mavis is going to teach my child Zulu, so that, and it's like, but why aren't you learning Zulu so you can communicate with your child? So adoption is great, but then it comes where adoptive parents can be problematic, and it's actually a bit very racist. There's no level.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. We live in Bloemfontein, so you can imagine how problematic it is. The one thing that I can tell you is that there is this thing called crossover potential. My eldest child is very dark-skinned, very curly hair. My youngest child is very light-skinned, her hair is curly like mine. She is accepted more widely than my eldest child. Yes, in terms of culture and the link with identity, there is definitely, it's something that I also have, that I'm also busy researching. On many of the Facebook groups where adoptive parents kind of get together, because where else will we get together? There's a big question about how far should adoptive parents go in order to accommodate the child's born culture. So there are questions like, where in Cape Town can I take classes where I can learn isiZulu? But then also the thing is, when you have brown children that's like my children are colored, how much of the colored identity is enforced white identity? How much of what the colored identity is what the colonizers gave them to be? How much of this is a trope? How much of it is a stereotype? But it definitely is problematic, and what's great for me is at the moment is that adoptees are starting to speak out about this. Adoptees are starting to say, but my adoptive parents did X, Y, and Z. I wish they did A, B, and C. And I think it's very important that we start hearing the adoptees' voices, which is why I'm also working on books like Umbilicus by Paula Grubin and Killing Caroline by Sarah Jane King, which really foregrounds the struggle of the adoptee. Because as much as I know that as adoptive parents we struggle with where is our community, where do we find kinship and belonging, I know that it is just as big a struggle for the adoptees themselves.
Okay, so before I wanted to know, I'll catch you later. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Okay, so like Bloemfontein just because Bloem is home, ne? And I know how problematic yes. And like literally feelings are sitting here. I don't even know what's the trigger. But, and I missed your because I just wanted to ask where in Bloemfontein.
Where in Bloemfontein?
Yeah, but then I realized maybe I might be even crossing boundaries.
That's fine.
So
I work at the University of the Free State, so yes. Bless me.
Yeah. That's just so sad. I loved your presentation, what I thought about the revisiting mother, and I wanted to find out from you, is your work out? Where can someone get it and engage with it? And because I'm really interested in it, or maybe I'll just talk to you afterwards. But to applaud and congratulate you on the work that you did, because there's this net where black children are sitting on, and a lot of black children are sleeping through that net, and they are falling, and it's like our hands are. So to hear a success story where black people fought, people actually came together, and there's success. Prices were withdrawn, but more so in thinking about how do we make the perpetrators pay in a way that they really feel it and there's a real change? Because whiteness escapes on a thread of apology all the damn time. A thread of apology, workshop here, workshop there, and we're talking shop all the way. But when blackness is caught in the same stride somewhere differently by white system, you get dealt with thoroughly. The disciplinary system or society will deal with you to the core. So how then do they keep escaping through the apologies so that we lessen the gratitude on us for they got the message, they apologized, they did the workshop. You did one hell of a job and they needed to have gotten more. So maybe it's just a question for all of us. How do we find ways to make the perpetrators pay in a way that hits them hard and makes the other feel that we will not get away with this? Because it's a reoccurring, and you're saying it's 3 kids before that.
Yes. Can you take them 2 questions?
Hanta, thank you all. Hanta, my question was around, well, I don't know if it's so much a question, but I hear the adoptive parents. I think that's one part of what you're talking about. But the other part was about Philiswa, right? And I was wondering if it is as easy to make the argument that you're saying you're wanting to make as Fiela as having adopted this boy, particularly in light of like just earlier, because that's like an early 80s novel, and then just earlier there's that Poppy Nongema by Elsa Hubert, that's late 70s. So both those kinds of novels by white women centralizing black women characters, centralizing narratives about their lives, novels and stories that at the time it was like, oh, it's interesting stories about black women, but not seeing them as political, powerful, now finding new lives, particularly at this very moment. I mean, Philiswa is coming out next week.
Exactly.
A remake of it, and Poppy Nongema is coming out early next year. So in these adaptations, there's also kind of rewriting of what those narratives mean in a contemporary way.
Exactly.
So I don't know if it's so much a question, but really for me what's interesting is that those novels they are black women at the center of the narrative, but essentially it's also still very much about whiteness and about white women.
Exactly.
Right? And so I'm wondering how you bring, or if you intend to perhaps bring in that element of that white savior conversation is very much a part of the fictional space that you're interested in, as well as the kind of contemporary real life stories, right? And so so there's stuff there, right?
Definitely, because so much of adoption narratives has the white savior narrative kind of embedded in it. And I think what I'm actually trying to do is to reread it, which is ironic as I'm a white woman, but trying to reread it in a new light. When I was working on this, I was wondering, can I really impose feminist theory on this text? Because feminism didn't even exist at the time when Fiela was alive. And then I thought, well, at least it existed by the time that Matia was alive. But I think in the same way, we need to reread it with a new lens now, with other lenses of critical theory, so that we can foreground the voices of those women, not necessarily the women who wrote the novels, but the women in the novels. Let's foreground the characters themselves, to give a voice to the brown bull in the ring, to give a voice to the Saki Bartman, to give a voice to Fiela, and look at their journey specifically, not that it was written from a white perspective, but let's try to let the characters speak for themselves.
Thank you so much for your invitation and protecting my place. Good. Mine is just maybe a comment, especially again on issue of the adoption. Yes, you have to open it and I'm sorry. And I will just talk as someone who has adopted, and for me, my experience is how South Africa, especially the adoption welfare center, there's still a lot of things that I don't know how South Africa is going to be ready to talk about the issue of race, culture, and identity, which was a huge issue for me. And it's like you are in two positions. You want to adopt, and you are careful about what you say.
Yes.
Because now, what was interesting is how I saw some of the potential parents that wanted to adopt. They don't want to talk about the things that we just see. Like, guys, do you see what is happening here?
Because it's uncomfortable.
Because they are desperate to get the children. But if we are doing this, we are creating more problems later for ourselves and even for the children. Because we are not going to talk about these issues, what these issues of race and culture and identity. Because most of these children, they are staying in their homes that are run by white people. And they are already also socialized around whiteness. Yes. Then when you come to your space, you have to do another work now of trying to, because with my experiences, like where there's our child comes from, all the children that they speak English, they have English names, and it's like you're in a different world, like, okay, what is going on here? But then also I saw even systematically in the administration, because as a parent that you have to go through the admin and doctor's checkup. They give you a list of only white doctors. And you ask like, where are other doctors? And they look at you like, is that a problem? I said, it's the trick question.
Yes.
But they are, sorry.
Thank you. Can you give Faith a chance to respond? If you want to.
I think it wasn't a question.
It wasn't a question.
I think she just
But
I think what I can mention also is that we used what we call collective motherhood to mobilize people to support this campaign, which helped because we ended up having even the Finnish Feminist Association and Gender Association supporting us. So Sahwira transcended the rest, and we had many from different groups supporting our campaigns. So I think you can also use collective motherhood from indigenous knowledges and how to mobilize people from different backgrounds to support you.
Thank you all for coming. Unfortunately, I cannot take more questions. They start in the other side.